Okay, so I see people are coming in into the room.
Oh
I'll
my
wait.
God, there really are people here. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Believe it or not, Ta-Nehisi, there are actually some people who are interested in this book.
Wow.
It's a friend. um,
Okay.
yeah. So I'll just wait maybe until it gets to it. It stops going up. Yeah, we had a
I
lot.
gotta up my fee, man.
Yeah, there was I'm not usually this popular just myself. Um, all right, it looks like it's kind of slowed a little bit. So I'm uh, I'm not going to introduce Ta-Nehisi because he doesn't need to be introduced, just to except to know that the book, if you just heard about the book, it doesn't do justice to actually reading the book. So we're going to put the book in in the chat. In the chat will just be for his book. I'm also putting in a book by my friend Fida Jiris, and some chat, and for medical aid for Palestinians, and a couple other things, including in my book. People can just so the people should the chat will be disabled, but you can put questions in the Q&A. And those will be monitored, and some of them will be sent to me. So I'll see if I can get to a couple after the questions that I have. So I guess I wanted to just start. First of all, I'm super grateful for you doing this. I know how unbelievably, I just have a tiny sense of what your life has been like over the last couple of weeks, and it's tiring even to watch it. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me. And as I said, I'm gonna now apologize to everybody in the chat. I really am sorry for this messy hotel room. I'm sorry. I really am sorry for doing this here. But yes, thanks for having me, Peter.
So I wonder if you can take us back to the moment that you started telling people that your next book was going to have a big section on Palestine and Israel, and what some of those conversations were like when you told people that. And if there's any one particular conversation that really sticks out about the kind of ways people reacted. And I'm wondering if people close to you had like real fears.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's only appropriate that I take this, back to our conversations, which literally go back years, and you telling me, wow, you have to go, you have to go. I feel like every time I saw you, you were like, you have to go. And then I saw you maybe in May of 2023. And I think it was you and Rula Jabril, as I recall.
Mhm.
And I said to you, I'm going next week. You know what I mean? And did people have fears for me taking this on? Yes and no. Yes, but I think also there was a sense that it was the right thing to do. You know what I mean? A lot of people felt that it was the right thing to do. Oddly enough, I think maybe the fears that a lot of people think of were not ones that were manifested really in my life or that people really cared about. I.e., um, my perception or people's perception of me. In certain quarters, I have had the luxury of my private life being pretty separate from my public life. Um, and in my private life, it's not that I don't have some work friends. I do, or some friends or people from work that I care about very much. I do. But in my private life, I'm actually not that important. Um, and my status as a writer is really kind of irrelevant. It doesn't get me much, among my friends and family. And so I never felt like like I wasn't gonna lose them. So, what did it really matter? And I know that there is and it's quite clear, I think the past couple of weeks have demonstrated the reaction people have when you just tell them what you saw or what you've read. Um, that yes, there is a lot of pressure put on, so that certain stories are not heard. But I don't know what was the point of getting this far in my career as a writer. Like if you're gonna not touch the sensitive things. Like what's the point? Why are we doing this?
Yeah. One of the things that I've always wondered about is, if you look at the American media, you look at a panel on cable TV, you look at the op-ed page of the New York Times, at this point in 2024, when it comes to domestic politics and policy, if you're talking about mainstream liberal media, there is some Black representation, right?
Mm.
Maybe not
Yes,
enough,
there
but
is.
not zero. Then
Yes.
when you turn to foreign policy, when they switch to the foreign policy segment, not just Israel, Palestine, anything,
Yeah.
right? That all disappears, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's nothing. That's why do you think that is? And why do you think what is the cost of that to America's public conversation about America's role in the world?
Yeah, and there are a few people, Howard French has made a career
Yes,
like this. I
yes.
think Eugene Robinson back in the day before he became a columnist, is it Helene
Right.
Cooper also? I think maybe has done
Karen
something.
is now doing that.
Yeah, yeah. So there are a few of us, but I think there's something. The natural portion of this is as follows. We were all very deeply concerned about our ability to represent ourselves and our ability to represent, have a voice in the conversation around race and racism in this country. And so that was like the area that was prioritized. But I think I think Charlene Hunter Galt is the other person I have to shout out.
Oh,
You know,
yeah, yeah,
but I think getting that worldliness is just different, just on a basic class level. Given the type of environments that most African Americans come from, we tend to not be the most traveled people. We just haven't. We just don't know the world. And I will say, like, well within my lifetime as an adult and as a working journalist, I was shocked to discover how Central America was in world affairs. It's mind blowing. Like to go out in the world and actually see it. It's like really, really mind blowing. And I think in our minds, like we're off, in our little ghettos, in our little corners, doing our little writing, and we don't realize like how tied we are to this bigger thing. We know there's a world out there, but the extent to which we're tied, we don't quite understand it.
You're a deep student of history, and I wonder when you were thinking about this move towards writing about the world outside the United States, and but bringing your experience and your lens that you have as a student of Black history and as Black American, if there were precedents that you thought of. I mean, what I immediately thought of when I heard you were writing this book was King's speech on Vietnam, but
Right.
also there's Du Bois, right, or Paul Robeson, people who brought a larger critique of the Cold War about American imperialism but while connected to a view on race. I'm wondering, were there precedents that you thought about when you thought about now extending your writing more abroad and especially on Palestine and Israel?
Yes and no. Yes, from an inspiration level, you know what I mean? Like this question of fear, I've talked about this. Like weirdly enough, what I thought back to is the long history of Black journalists in this country and how it was never a safe occupation. That Ida B. Wells was never safe. Walter White is like going into the South, passing as a white man to investigate lynchings. He could have been killed at any moment. I thought about that a lot, but the no part of it is I think what makes it difficult. Like you, I am a product of what you might call, I don't know, literary journalism, new journalism, or whatever. Like that particular craft that is practiced at the New Republic, New Yorker, Atlantic. Like I come out of that world, and on a and I believe you must be able to relate to this. Like on a craft level, I love the thing. You know what I mean? I love long form as a thing, but the politics of that world are so bad on this. You know what I mean? Like they and so like and part of this is in that essay, right? Like my love for a thing, because like that is a way of thinking too. That's a way of analyzing the world. You know what I mean? Where you mix all of these, like you pull a little bit from the world of literature, you pull a little bit from the world of books, you pull a little bit from the world of reporting to create, this thing. And I love that as a method. Um, there are precious few Black people who have had the space to pursue that, and even fewer who've had the space to pursue it internationally. And so that part was very lonely and very, very isolating. There are people who I learned from, people who I admire as craftspeople, you know what I mean, who are so distant, from my politics on this. And that a lot of that essay is me working through that.
Yeah, yeah. Um, one of the things that I wonder if you've thought about is it seems to me peculiar that there's a whole class of people, including many of the people at those kind of magazines that you mentioned that you and I worked at, that are willing to hear you say that America is a racist country, but
Right.
they're not willing to hear you say Israel is a racist country. And America is our country, right? How do you explain the fact that that at least in those circles, you can say harsher things about the United States and oppression in terms of the United States than you can about a country where people aren't even living?
So I would say two things. Like there's this great book called Our American Israel,
Mhm.
by this woman, Amy Kaplan,
Mhm.
who regrettably passed away from brain cancer. But it looks at the culture, the cultural, I guess, similarities between the two
Mhm.
countries, like how culture influenced it. And she points out that the story that America tells itself, is a story that actually has a lot that rhymes with the story Israel tells
Yes.
itself. This gets very dark in certain places, by the way, which we can talk about later. But as to your question, I think it's a couple of things. I think the fact that what you cite, like the ability to say that about it, like that was a fight. Like,
Mm.
that was not always true. You know what I mean? That is not a natural development that just sort of happened. That was a fight that was every bit as vicious as the fight that's happening right now. On behalf of Palestinians, and empowering them to tell their own story, and opening up the perspectives. It was like this. It was like this. I mean, I was watching a documentary on the Kerner Report,
Mm.
um, a couple nights ago. And every single like they had news footage, every single television journalist that they put, they were all white, all of them. You know what I mean? And their perspective would not have been the perspective of the people that were out in the streets. And so what I stand on is like the shoulders of a very, very long fight, waged by some of the journalists that I named earlier to get to this position where you could be on the cover of the Atlantic and say, and make the case for reparations, right? That was not true 10 years before that. That was not true 20 years before that. And so I think we are just at the beginning of what I hope, will be a successful struggle and a successful fight to change that and to open, some things up. I think that's the first thing. But Peter, I think there's something deeper too. It is immensely troubling. And I wanted to sit in this tension and in this trouble to accept that a group of people can suffer from existential collective punishment, that can suffer from industrialized genocide, which itself is the climax of centuries of oppression, of pogroms, ethnic cleansing, mass murder, other genocidal violence, et cetera. It runs the gamut, plundering, et cetera. And say that that legacy is now attached to a state that is pursuing similar violence against another group of people. Like, that's not just dark because the state is Jewish.
Mm.
I contend it is actually dark because it forces us to face some things about ourselves and maybe even some of the underlying, linchpins and pillars of progressivism and the left. Like this idea that somehow like the oppressed are ennobled or oppression is ennobling, that there can be this broad alliance of oppressed people. Um, like there's something dark here that is beyond Israel itself, that I think is really, really hard to face.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I found most intriguing about the book and that some of the statements I've heard you made is that you seem particularly interested in what Black Americans should learn from this, from the way that the dominant political story that that Jews ended up taking collectively from the Holocaust was, we need our own state, a state based on supremacy. And I was been thinking, what exactly does that mean? Like, what is the danger that Ta-Nehisi is thinking about? Is he talking about Liberia? Is he talking about, then I thought, does it have to do with, could it connect to Black Panther and Wakanda as a vision? And then I heard you say this thing in the Ben Rhodes interview, which was very powerful, where you basically said that something, I'm paraphrasing. You said basically about Kamala Harris and the Democrats, Kamala Harris, sorry, gosh. And you said it was a very black convention, and so in some sense, these are black bombs. So talk to me about what it is that the warning, this universal warning, but particularly the one that you're relating to black Americans here.
Yeah, so in the case of Israel, I would say, and this is I have never said this out loud really, but it's something that I've been, marinating on, so I don't quite have this down. But I really think it's important to understand that like this idea of a state as safety was rooted in a European, very, in fact, German romantic idea that states somehow verified peoples.
Mhm.
That there were states, that this was tied to land, that this was tied to language, that this was tied to culture. And those were particular things for particular people. Again, that's not a Zionist, idea. That was an idea of
Yes,
the time that you can see in manifestations
yes,
across.
the age of nationalism. Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. I mean, in fact, Nazism is very tied to that idea, for instance.
Mhm.
And so and Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but what I saw the thinkers of that age doing was saying, okay, we are oppressed, not necessarily questioning the premises
Mhm.
or the frame of the era, but actually accepting them
Mhm.
and saying, this we need to go and do X, Y, and Z, and that will be our liberation. Again, I'm at pains to say this. That is not a Jewish era.
Right.
You actually see it across African American history also. Not really. Sometimes we question the frame, but sometimes we accept it and say, we just need to do X, Y, and Z.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? And we don't, ask deep questions about like the models that we're actually, doing. And so to fast forward that into today, I'm out at the DNC. And again, it's a very black convention, blackest convention I've ever seen. You
Uh-huh.
know what I mean? It was such that the first night I was out there, I was like, are they gonna have a white person talk? Like, geez, you know what I mean? Like, it's in this group chat. I say this all the time, and a guy made the joke, and he said, this convention is so black that the first white person to talk was Steve Kerr, basketball coach. You
Right.
know, um, and you're seeing all this, and the models are Jesse Jackson's running 84 and 88, and the models are Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Chisholm and they're Native Americans there, who are making, their cars, and they're there. The Latinos are there making, they're was very inclusive, which has always been at the core of the best of the black struggle. That this is not just us, this is all of us, except it's not all of us, except it's not all of us. And I look outside and I see, a group of people, who can't even speak on the floor, can't even like make a speech, like not, get up there and yell free Palestine, but actually can't even be allowed to talk, right? Um, and this is at a convention to nominate a black woman, right? Who bears all of that legitimacy, all of that legacy. That's dangerous. That's dangerous because it means that did we really learn the lesson of Fannie Lou Hamer? Or was the lesson just that, look, slavery is not wrong. Being the slave is what's wrong. And that is a dark prospect. That's a dark prospect. And when I was in Israel, you know what I mean? When I was in the West, on the West Bank, like the saddest thing for me was that the Israeli state project does not question the frame, that it accepts the frame. And I guess like for us to just accept, the frame that Joe Biden has presented to us, that the Democratic Party has presented us, that the last, I don't know, umpteenth years and decades of politics have presented to us, on Israel and towards Palestinian would be a grievous mistake. And in fact, a hijacking and a betrayal of the legacy that brought us here in the first place.
I'm curious whether you have had pushback from people, from Black Americans on this question, because I would say, I, like many Jews, have spent my entire life having this argument. I had it with my grandmother. I had it my whole life. And people like to put a kind of critify this story about Israel being a liberal democracy. But as you rightly intuited, at the end of the day, the hard kernel of the argument, which someone like Jabotinsky made more honestly than a lot of other people, is, man is a wolf to man, right? And we are not going to be the people to take the risk on a fundamentally different world. And, you know, Arthur Hertzberg, before he died, once said to me that he had been in a debate with Edward Said, and Said said, why would Jews want a state after all the brutality of states? Jews were so creative in diaspora. And Arthur said, yes, these states, they're terrible, they're brutal. We'll give ours up fifth, you know? So I'm curious, when you make this argument and someone says to you, wait a second, you want Kamala Harris to endanger her chance of being the first Black woman president on a basis of principle for Palestinians, given how precarious the situation for Black, and with Donald Trump there, do you get that pushback?
Weirdly, no.
Huh.
But I think, you see, the difference is that there is the imaginative impulse has always been there, right? You know, you started off talking about like it reminded you of King and the Vietnam speech and all. Like, people remember that.
Yeah.
You know, what they forget at the time is that everybody was mad at King for doing that.
Yes, right.
You know what I mean?
Thought he would jeopardize the civil rights.
Thought he would jeopardize, but he is the model, not the, you know, like it also works the other way. People don't remember the critique. Like, they don't remember that, but they remember him as an ideal. Like, this idea that it was always supposed to be bigger than you is intrinsic in the struggle. Like, we started the tour, you know, at the Apollo Theater, right in the heart of Harlem with Ayman Mohideen. And people were very, very happy to have that conversation. I mean, I was, you know, you can't get any more in the center, you know, of the Black community than right there. You know what I mean? And we had that very open conversation there. It does not mean that you don't vote, you know, for Kamala. And I think people are clear on that. You know what I mean? I also think there is a sense that we already did the symbolic thing. Like, we did that once. You know, we did that. We gave, you know, Obama all of, you know, the room and et cetera. And so I don't think I am the only one who thinks this one has to mean something. Like, this one has to mean something more than symbols if it's going to be real, you know, that the pageantry is not quite enough. I suspect, and I don't know what people are doing in their private moments, but just because, I don't know, I haven't, like, Black people come up to me in the street and thank me for talking about this. I have not had the Black person come up to me yet to say, you are endangering, or the Black woman come up to me and say, you are endangering this. You know, and I don't know, maybe if I was more resentful, like, personally, of Kamala, which I'm not, you know, look, I watched the debate like everybody else and was very happy to see her take apart Donald Trump. I was gratified like everybody else, you know, and you can feel that, you know what I mean? And at the same time, feel that this has to stand for something. I feel like I'm pulling from a very real tradition. So it's not just really me talking, you know, when I say this.
Yeah. Just because you mentioned Obama, I can't help but ask it. You were obviously known for having conversations with him. Do you think if he was reading your book, he would say the Palestinian Israel sucking, he'd say, yeah, I know all that. I knew all that. That he always knew this, but he just couldn't do anything about it.
So I know people who were close to him at a different point in his life, and they say he knows. They say he knows. They say it's impossible for him not to be at the University of Chicago and not know. To have gone to Columbia and not known, given what those environments are. I'm very, like, Chicago is home to the largest Palestinian diaspora in the country.
Right. And Khalidi was there.
Right. Exactly. It's actually hard to not know. Now, I don't, you know what I mean? I haven't talked to him. I don't know if that's a reality, or I haven't had, and at the time, I wish I had known more at the time that I, you know, was in conversation and done those interviews. I certainly would have pressed more. You know, looking back on his presidency, he kind of acted like somebody who knew, but maybe, and now I'm getting into speculation, also felt that there was little he could actually do.
Right.
Someone once told me, who, as I said, knew him at a different point in life, said that not only did he know, but Bibi knew that he knew.
Yes.
Bibi hated him for it. You know?
Yes. And I think that's exactly right. And I think there were a lot of people in the organized American Jewish community and the Israeli government who suspected he knew, or thought because he's Black, he's likely to know, or he's likely to suspect, and that makes him dangerous.
Is that your sense of him? Was that your sense of him?
my sense of him was that the story he told was about his connection to progressive and liberal Jews.
Right.
And he wrote about he said he read David Grossman's book, Yellow Wind. He talked about his relationship with Arnold Jacob Wolff, who was progressive by Jewish, and he talked about himself being a liberal Jew and all this thing. And I'm sure there's some truth to that, but I also wonder whether that was an easier thing for him to say politically than to say, I actually also feel sometimes like a Palestinian, or I identify with, like, that would have been impossible, right? And so he could say this thing, which was to say, I'm with these group of Jews, not with these group of Jews, but he couldn't say, I really identify with the Palestinians.
Right, 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 right.
And Kamala, do you have any sense of whether she knows?
I have heard from several people, or a few people, from different spaces, that they have had private conversations with her that indicate some sympathy. That indicates a position that is different than Biden. No, what that will mean,
yeah,
and how that will be manifested, I don't know.
Yeah.
I will be honest with you. I mean, to the extent that, this is probably the closest I've ever been to any sort of activism, in the sense that I feel that I have a certain position in American life and can yell things. What effect that has, I don't know, but I have a responsibility to yell, and to point out, like, the grievous problem and the great damage of being the first Black woman president and having 2,000-pound bombs with your name on them dropping on Gaza. That's a nightmare. I think, like we think about voting and politics in a very just get past this one kind of way, like a very practical, tangible way. But I do think, should Kamala win this year, and 2028 comes around, I think the moral problem will become a practical problem if nothing changes. I actually do believe that. I think because what you will be effectively saying, like, at that point, like, say we're in 2028, right? Okay, so this is 20 years of this election is the most important election in our lifetime. Okay, so now I have to look at the content of those elections. And effectively, what you are telling me is the price of protecting a woman's right to choose is support for apartheid and genocide. Like, that is the rough math of what you are saying to me.
Right.
There are women in Palestine too. And I don't know that people will articulate it that way, but I'm like, that will be in the air. You know what I mean? And that's tough, man. That's hard.
Right. Or it's like the cost of the New Deal was sustaining Jim Crow.
That's right. That's right. That's what it'll be effectively. And this is what I mean by tonight. So now, like, okay, so we're not questioning systems anymore. We just need power. That's all we're saying.
Right.
Like, the systems are no longer the problem. And that's, at that point, I don't, like, I wonder where I will be, and who I will be as a political person, because that would be deeply problematic for me.
Yeah. So because the book is so interested in this question of why victimization doesn't necessarily ennoble, it requires you to tell a story, and that there are various stories, and some of those stories are very, very dark. I was wondering whether you thought about that vis-a-vis Palestinians, who are in the midst of this, they're in the midst of it now, of this unimaginable slaughter. Is it right? Is it fair to have that question about Palestinians now, about how Palestinians narrate their own excruciating ongoing dismemberment? Because one could say that Hamas, which has something of an Islamist supremacist vision, is its own dark version of that story, right? In that it's not really within an equality framework, that the story that it's telling about what's happened to Palestinians, right? And so I'm curious, or is it not fair to ask that of people while they're going through it, and that you ask that question after it's stopped?
You know what? Not only do I think it's fair, I think if Palestinians weren't pushed out of the frame, you would see that conversation. I think they would have it. Because I've had it privately. You know what I mean? Like, with many of the people that influenced this book. I mean, they are not, like, gutter, sort of patriots, nationalists, unthinking, people. But when, like, you can't name a Palestinian bureau chief at a major news, like, there's no room. There's just no room. You know what I mean? I take them to be, you know, human beings like any other thinking group of intelligent human beings with differences and thoughts and visions and ideas. And but what happens, part of, sucking the oxygen out, and keeping them out is like that kind of nuance that you just got at, like there's just no room for it. There's just no room for it, And so yes, I mean, yes, certainly so. Certainly so. And I think it would happen. Like I don't think it is as taboo as maybe people think. I think the structure makes it very hard for that. You know what I mean? Because then you're lucky if you get, like one Palestinian in discussion. You know what I mean? And then they have to speak to the whole of it, right? Which is an impossible position to be in. Like entry is, will you denounce Hamas?
Right.
Right. Like that becomes, and we get settled on these kind of, mean questions, but really you should alter the frame. You know what I mean? Like maybe if you had 3 or 4 up there, you know what I mean? Like the conversation would be different and you would get something a little bit more textured and nuanced.
Right. Right. So a lot of people have kind of come at you a little bit on this question of why you didn't engage with the pro-Israel arguments. And the thing that did occur to me was some of your writing that I have found most powerful has been involved in dissecting arguments made to defend power. I'm thinking of particularly like the first white president. You go through George Packer, Nick Kristof, Bernie Sanders, right? And you basically dismantle the claims that they're making about Trump's ascendancy not being about what racism and white supremacy. You have done a lot of that in your when you did a blog. I'm just curious why. So you were interested in dismantling the kind of exoneration of white America that you saw around you, but you decided not to do that same project when it came to the kind of exoneration of Israel or of Israeli Jews. How come?
So I would say 2 things. I would say it actually is there. I would say like that's the point of Jabotinsky. That's the point of Herzl. That's the point of Benny Morris. That's the point of Moses Hess. You know what I mean? It is there. But I'm dealing with a group of people who like don't have the microphone. It's very different. Like I wrote Case for Reparations into a world where there was like this problem of access of Black people to the mainstream narrative. It just wasn't on. And like I'm living in a world where like the Black Panther is a movie. You know what I mean? Like you can't like imagine an analog, for Palestinians at all. And so what I think happened that maybe is throwing people is, I guess in some ways my work was kind of a corrective because I probably centered their frame, a little more than maybe, I felt like I had to. But like, I think if I took that critique at its highest, what it says is I did not go and interview settlers, for instance, which I didn't do. Maybe I would have done if that was the entirety of the whole book. Maybe I would have done that. But the urgent thing for me felt that I wrote the Case for Reparations, and in using reparations from West Germany to the state of Israel, I felt that I had erased the people. That essay is about correcting that. You know what I mean? And looking at Zionism, from a particular vantage point. But that is the large motivation for that. And I guess I would just say over and over again, the Zionist argument, it's not without its hearing. It's not hard to access. It's not hard to get to. It's not hard to find. It's not hard to, it's everywhere. It is, the air around us. The arguments that, I present in that book are counter. And I guess, the last thing I'll say about that is, how often do we ask the question of authors who are sympathetic to Israel? How often do we say, hey, how many Palestinians have you interviewed? And more, and I'll take it back to this again. How often do we interrogate the very structures? Who is looking at our magazines and our newspapers to say, how many, Palestinian authors are you publishing? Like, where are Palestinians in this narrative? And so I find it interesting that I am, being subject to a level of critique, which I will happily answer for.
Right.
But a critique that is not actually made of the structures that actually have the most power.
Right. No, it's true. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say, Ta-Nehisi Coates only spent 10 days in the West Bank. And my response to people privately as well as publicly has been, okay, I know you've been to Israel 25 times, and I know which hotels you've stayed at in Tel Aviv. But I bet those 10 days he spent in the West Bank is
Yeah,
significantly more than the number of days that you spent with Palestinians in the West Bank on all, you've been going there since you were 13, right? So it's like, it's all about what you see when you're there as opposed to the number of days that you're there.
yeah.
Um, you are kind of known for not being an optimist about the course of history.
Mm,
And the book in some ways is about the way in which violence begets violence, victimization begets victimization. As you think about where Palestine and Israel may go from here, you're a student of the Civil War, which was not a nonviolent end to slavery. I know you've thought a lot about the Haitian Revolution, which was not a nonviolent end to oppression. We do have the example of the Civil Rights Movement, or South Africa. Help me think about how you think about potentially different models, and is it possible to avoid that tragedy in which all of this violence that is heaped upon Palestinians just ends in a bloodbath for everybody, in which of horrendous, I mean, we're in the midst of it now, but in which it just basically engulfs all the people between the river and the sea.
So I'll say the dark part of this first. Even our nonviolent revolutions have the specter of violence behind them. I don't know that you can divorce the civil rights movement from World War II. I don't know that you can divorce South Africa and apartheid, and you would know this better than me, from the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like I think that's, even if, the revolutionaries themselves are not violent, the specter of it is really always there. Having said that, there is something that is very, very powerful in this struggle, that is at hand, and that is that the truth is blatantly obvious, and the lie is critically important to the project. I think, there are a lot of people who say, well, I feel like Americans don't want to know. I'm not sure that's true, because there's a ton of energy put in them, into the project of them not knowing. Like there is a lot of effort. You know what I mean? And so I always have to ask, well, if that were true, why is so much effort put into crafting a narrative? Like if that's actually true. I actually am of the mind that it is very hard for human beings to do horrific violence or perpetrate horrific violence on other human beings with their eyes wide open. I actually, and that's one of the theories in the book. Like, I actually think that's actually hard to do. So I think knowing does matter. And the telling of what it is not hard. Like the problem, what is happening on the West Bank, the fact that Israel is not a democracy, like, you can explain this in about 2 sentences. It is not like, and that was like the biggest surprise. Like, I guess when people said it was complex, and people make like this is morally complex or whatever, like that's what I thought. I thought I was gonna go over and see some, really morally complex, but I didn't. I mean, it was so obviously immoral. It is blatantly immoral, like blatantly, and I think the argument that it's not is extremely hard to make. And the shadow of that to me is that when you make it, people don't say this is not happening. They say, yes, but what did they do to deserve it? That is effectively the counter argument.
Yes, that Israel had no choice.
Right. Israel had no choice but to perpetrate apartheid.
Right.
That is the truest, rendition of the argument.
Right. And I'm curious. So this kind of now, like, somewhat most famously came up in that CBS interview, basically, right? Where it's basically like, why aren't you acknowledging all the ways in which the Palestinians brought this on themselves, or in which Israel had no choice but to do all of that? And I'm curious, you have made a very conscious decision, basically, in these interviews to basically say, I'm not going to engage with that set of questions. I'm not going to talk about, why there were suicide bombings or what Iran wants to do. I'm basically going to just say none of it justifies this from my perspective. And I'm curious about because you must have thought a lot about that you were going to get this. So again, help me understand the decision to respond in that way.
There's always good reasons to perpetrate a system of apartheid, of segregation, of plunder, whatever. There are always good arguments. Always, always. I don't. Again, you're the better student of this than I am, but I suspect that if you read the documents justifying apartheid, the argument was not we are evil and we want to perpetrate apartheid.
Absolutely.
I don't think that was the argument. I
No,
know
a lot of them were very similar to the arguments we hear now.
Yes.
Africa's a tough neighborhood. How many times?
Right. And hey, it was. They do hate you.
Yeah, Idi Amin was there. It wasn't like
right. And no, they're not democracies. They're not.
Right.
It is true. All of that's true.
Right.
But the moral question still remains, and it's true for Black Americans too. There were arguments, in favor. Like I was telling somebody this the other day. They said, well, like we think because we've decided the arguments that the slavery, anti-slavery debate was not complex. It was. And from their perspective, it was. It was. They believed that an underpinning of democracy in a free country required a kind of elevation to which people of African descent had not, attained. So this idea that you were going to suddenly free them and let them become, part of the body politic, nobody would have done that without a war. It took a war, which gives you some idea of how radical the proposition actually was. They were very, very, there was an entire cast of what they call pro-slavery intellectuals,
right,
who made the case for why you needed slavery, why it was, as Calhoun called, a positive good.
Right. John Calhoun was not a dumb guy. Right?
No, these are not dumb people. You know what I mean? Like, so this was a very real argument. Segregation, you know what I mean? Within the lifetime of my parents, the argument was integration is dangerous. Look at the crime rates, in these Black neighborhoods. And the crime rates were high. They were. And so, like, why did we desegregate? Was that right or was that wrong? You know what I mean? Was abolition right or was it wrong? And I think what most people will say is none of that justified the upholding of an immoral system, period. And so if that is the argument, then why am I talking about suicide bombers? Why am I talking about the violence of Palestinians? Why am I talking about, either this is right or wrong, period. If you want to make the argument, I need to inflict apartheid and a violent system of segregation on this group of people because I am endangered, you should honestly and forthrightly make that argument. Right. I disagree with it.
Right.
I just have to disagree with it. You know what I mean? Because my moral underpinnings are different.
Yeah. No, this is one of the things that gets me about the Jewish community in some ways the most deeply is I encounter and listen to so many brilliant people. I listen to them talk about Talmud, Jewish texts, and I think there is so much brilliance and talent, and I'm so awed and dazzled and in love with the way here people, and then they switch to this issue, and it reminds me all of their brilliance is not getting us anywhere, because when it comes to this, there's basically, it's just, as you say, it's a simple moral question. And, we have a couple questions from the audience, one of which is about Black nationalism really well. I know it was even part of your upbringing. And I wonder if you can talk about the ways in which Black nationalism and Zionism are similar and the ways in which they're different.
Well, in fact, there's a long history of many Black nationalists actually, being Zionists themselves, and having great admiration, for Zionism. And I think what the impulse is you have a group of people suffering from, as I said, centuries of horrific oppression. And you see them go and build, a nation of their own. I mean, this is what it looks like, a nation of their own, where they can feel safe and they can feel good about, themselves and, they can, feel worthwhile. And so I think certainly from the outside, there's a kind of affinity, but actually the impulse is older. It goes back to where we started this conversation and that root in romantic nationalism, because there's a whole, series of 19th century Black nationalists who look to Africa in much the same way. and Liberia obviously being the example of a state that comes out of that,
mm,
but who very much believe that a state should be crafted in Africa. The dialogue about Africans from those Black American Black nationalists was
mm,
very, very similar to the dialogue that Zionists had about Palestinians, to the extent that they saw them, which is to say that we will go there and we will be a kind of fortress of civilization in darkest Africa. It's
mm,
very similar,
mm,
very, very similar. The treatment, the degradation of Black people in Africa, of Native Africans themselves by Black Americans,
mm,
very, very similar, very,
mm,
very similar. And so um, that's the first thing. I don't want to overly simplify this, because weirdly enough, there also is a strain of Black nationalism that is obviously very critical of Israel. You know
mm,
what I mean? That exists, in and of itself. Malcolm X, for instance, towards the end of his life, when he takes his travel and he actually goes to Gaza, you know what I
right,
mean? A lot of people, and I haven't explored this, enough to really know about this, but a lot of people point to Nasser, as an influential, figure, and his, attempt to craft a kind of, Pan-African, Pan-Arab, however you want to put it, and the appeal that had to
mm,
Black Americans. The thing is, the oldest Muslim communities in this country are Black communities.
mm, mhm,
There were enslaved people who were literate in the Quran who were
mm,
brought over here, and so Islam has a particular root and influence in the Black community that goes all the way back, you know what I mean, to Africa. And so I think that's part of it too, in
mm,
terms of like the complexity
mm,
of it. But for me, what I saw, and the thing that I really wanted to think about, is this temptation to not question systems,
mm.
to just accept the priors of even of the people that oppress you.
It's interesting you mentioned that long history of Black American Muslims. It was a Muslim friend of mine asked me to ask you whether the title, the message, is in any way a reference to the fact that, as I understand it, Muhammad in the Quran is called the messenger and that the Quran is called the message. Was that just accidental, or was there
That's
any?
just accidental. I mean, I
Yeah,
think that it's like just one of these sort of phrases. That was accidental.
yeah.
But he's not wrong. I mean, it's very hard to be, Black, particularly as a Black Northerner,
Mm,
somebody lives above the Mason-Dixon line, or, period, and not know Black people who are Muslims. It's
mm,
an
mm,
extremely common phenomenon in the Black
yeah.
community.
This question of Black nationalism, its different variations, and even its relembrance to Zionism, did that shape you? Created a Black country in Africa. I mean, you didn't create, you adapted it, right? Wakanda. Were you in Black Panther? Were you thinking about how did that influence? And did you think at
Yeah,
all about Israel and Zionism when you were fashioning
I was more
Wakanda?
thinking about nationalism.
Uh, uh,
It's more, but yeah, you can see it as a critique of, your idea of nation states and the idea of ethno states, and which is, yes, that is in that work. But I probably was more gaming out, what a real nationalism would be. I mean, in the fictive space, I mean, one of the things that you then have the ability to do is say, okay, so now I'm going to take all these questions of race off the table and like look at you as actual people, you know what I mean, who are, perpetrating a system. So, um, yes, questions of nationalism were there. I did not know enough about Zionism at that point, to kind of go that far.
we have a question about whether I mean, you have now worked across a whole bunch of different mediums. You think it's possible that you might go back to fiction or comics or movies and take this subject into a different medium?
Probably, probably. I hope so. I
Hmm.
hope so. I still enjoy that world, Yeah, I mean, I had to, obviously come back and do this, but yeah, I could see that. Yes.
Hmm. Just curious, is there since the book came out, is there like one particular interaction about it with somebody in public or in private, or a message or something that interaction that has really stuck with you?
Yes. The messages I have gotten from my Muslim friends, from my Arab friends, and my Palestinian friends. And what I have been told is they are very, very happy to see this perspective out in the world. Um, and the second part of that message has always been, because we can't do it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And that makes me really, really sad.
mm-hmm.
And so, yes, that very much sticks with me.
Yeah. You have this very powerful part of the book where you talk about being in the Chicago area in a group of Palestinian Americans, just Palestinian Americans, and the way they're talking to one another when there's nobody else around. And you compare it to the way Black Americans may talk when it's just them. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that's like to witness, and what we should learn from that kind of intimate grammar that people have when they have the comfort to not feel like they're worried about the external glare.
Mm. I'm hesitating because I feel like I don't want to betray them.
Mm.
Uh,
Okay.
it's you know, and I don't mean like that. Like I mean this in the sense that these are people that don't really have a public voice. And so like I feel a little awkward about rendering their private conversation public because they don't have the opportunity to do it public.
Right.
I will say that many of like getting to see them like think through October 7th, which they did. Like there was somebody in that group who was actually in Israel itself when October 7th happened. These are people who in their hearts are deeply committed, you know, to nonviolence. These are not, you know, Hamas is great, you know what I mean, sort of people. There was a woman there whose husband was, you know, born and raised in Gaza. She had been to Gaza. They were having a kind of conversation that you simply cannot have in public. And this actually goes back to your question about like interrogations, because like it wasn't a pep rally. Like it was, these are intellectual people who read things, you know, and so it was it was a back and forth debate, you know what I mean? You know, there was, you know, thoughts about this, thoughts about that, you know, and it's sad that there just is not room. We lose because they can't talk in public. We lose.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, no, and I would just call out, you know, for people who don't follow it, you know, like the Makdisi podcast that
Right.
Makdisi, and you know, you just, every time I listen to that converse, I think, wow, if you know, I don't necessarily agree with every single thing that people say on that podcast, I think if more of this showed up in the mainstream media, we would be having such a more sophisticated, smarter, you know, more valuable conversation.
And so then our policies are affected by that, by the way.
Absolutely,
You know?
absolutely. We're almost at it. So you did, just because you mentioned October 7th, you have mentioned, you're not the only one, the parallel with Nat Turner. And I wonder, I'd just like to hear you think about how you think, what is the right way and the wrong way for people to think about that, like an analogy like that, or for that matter, analogies with Native Americans, you know, who slaughtered, you know, indiscriminately, you know, white settlers in the United States in the 19th century. What is the value of that analogy, and what are the dangers of that analogy?
Well, so I think like from my basic politics, like I heard this, I was on Democracy Now! And they were interviewing this young lady who's a student leader, and she had this motto which she said, every life a universe.
Yes,
And
yes.
I really believe that.
Tradition, yeah.
Yeah, like I actually like I thought that was a wonderful way of saying it. So like I am not built in such a way that I can look at something like October 7th and say, yes, they were under an oppressive system and feel like I can't look at that and not be horrified. I just can't. Like I just, you know what I mean? Like let's just put, you know what I mean, political arguments aside. I am telling you in my soul, in my bones, I don't have the Constitution for that.
Right,
You know,
right.
I just don't. Nat Turner, who took as, you know, his, you know, cause and his ideology that everyone, all white people involved in the system of enslavement were guilty. Women, children, whatever. That children had to be killed because they were going to grow up to be enslaved. You know, his analysis was not wrong. Like the logic of it is not incorrect. In fact, like I would argue that like the logic of Sinwar, like there's an argument that like the logic is not wrong. But the morality of it, again, like I always struggled with Nat Turner. Like I always like I thought I was like, and I didn't have a vocabulary to explain why, but I always struggled with like that idea. And I think two things. First, like if you take as your belief, which for instance animates my anti-death penalty stance. You know what I mean? That you know, human life really is sacred. You know, that every life really is a universe. You know, and I guess I would push that further. And again, I'm talking about my politics. Like I would say that the minute you start looking coldly upon like the lives of people who are entrenched in systems, I wonder what the vision of your liberation is. Like, what is like, and I think it's really important to think like 5 steps ahead. Like, should you win, who are you going to be?
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
do I really want to live in a state run by you? Do I want to live like, do I
Right.
want to be part of a society
Right.
in which you have power?
Right.
I'm not sure I do.
Right.
So like where are we going here? And I understand that's very, very difficult work,
Right.
for oppressed people to do.
Yeah.
But I think it's important,
Yeah.
and like I think how you fight actually is important. I'm uncomfortable making those kinds of declarations because I really think the people that need to be hashing this out,
Right.
in public are not me.
Yes.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? The people that can speak to this in a direct kind of way,
Yes.
are not me. But if you ask me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, how I feel, that's how I feel. Those are
Yeah.
my politics.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ta-Nehisi, the reason that I kept badgering you all those years was because I just had this sense that even though Palestinians were working heroically against incredible odds to basically change this conversation, and that there were a few of us lunatic, self-hating Jews who were trying to do something that we wouldn't be able to do it, and that we needed the cavalry, and that you are a big part of that cavalry.
Did you think I would actually go, or did you think I'd never go?
I didn't know you well enough
Right,
to know,
right.
because I didn't know how seduced you were by power and celebrity. And
Yes, yes,
now
yes.
I know. Now I
Yes.
know and now I know something about you that I didn't know you well enough to know. If I'd known you better, I probably would have known, but I
Right,
didn't know then. And I
right.
just have to say, to me, what's so beautiful about it is that I really believe that as much as being Jewish is at the center of my being and I care about my people, this is not a struggle of tribe against tribe. It has to be the opposite of that, right?
Yeah,
And it has to
yeah.
be a movement like the great movements that bring together people from every possible background, bringing their own traditions of humanity, to bear, and their own experience. And that's what you did in the book. And I'm super, super grateful for it. And for this hour we got to talk.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
All right.